The body was still warm. Yet the clock on the mantel insisted Edward Whitmore had been dead for nearly an hour. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the blood, not the overturned chair, not the broken glass that glittered across the Persian rug like scattered teeth. The warmth. I pressed 2 fingers to the side of Edward Whitmore's neck, and I felt it. A faint, fading heat that told me he had not been dead for long. Perhaps 40 minutes, perhaps less. The inspector had not yet arrived. His men had not yet walked through the door. No boot had disturbed the dust. No gloved hand had moved a single object. The room was exactly as the killer had left it. And in minutes, the inspector would arrive and begin moving everything. I used every second. This is my diary. These are my case notes. And I'm going to show you 9 details I found in that room. Details that the official police missed entirely, and explain precisely what each one told me about how Edward Whitmore died and who was responsible. Walk with me. It was the 23rd of November, 1894, a Tuesday. The kind of cold morning where the fog never quite lifts from the Thames, and London smells of coal smoke and something older, something the city refuses to name. I had received a telegram at 7 o'clock that morning from Lady Whitmore herself. It said only 4 words. Edward is dead. Come. Within the hour, Watson and I were at Whitmore Manor. The manor stood on the south side of a wide street in Kensington. 4 stories, pale stone. The kind of house that announces its owner's wealth without ever raising its voice. Lady Whitmore met me at the door. Her eyes were dry, which I noted. Not because grief had not touched her. It had. I could see that clearly enough in the set of her jaw. But because she was a woman who had decided that weeping could wait. She was 51 years old, and she wanted answers first. A practical woman. I approved of that. She led me to her husband's study on the ground floor. I asked her to remain outside. She did not argue. I stepped into the room, and I began. The first thing I examined was not the body. I know that strikes most people as strange. A man lies dead in his own study, and the detective ignores him to look at a windowsill. But the body could wait. The body was not going anywhere. The window, however, told a story that no one else in that room had thought to read. The sill was thick with dust, the kind of dust that accumulates over weeks, not days. The housemaids had been told not to clean the study while the master was working on his accounts, and so the dust had been left to settle. But in that dust, pressed as clearly as any signature, were 2 parallel marks. The marks of 2 elbows. Someone had stood outside that window, on the narrow stone ledge, 2 feet above street level, and leaned their forearms against the glass, for long enough to leave those impressions in the dust. And they had done it facing inward, watching. I looked at the marks carefully. The dust at the edges had begun to resettle very slightly. The marks were not fresh. They had been made at least 1 full day before, perhaps 2. The killer had not arrived at Whitmore Manor that morning. They had been watching it for days. This was not a crime of passion. This was not a sudden quarrel that turned violent. This was planned, carefully, coldly, patiently planned. I noted it in my mind and moved on. Edward Whitmore's body was slumped against his desk. The chair, a heavy leather-backed thing, had rolled back perhaps 3 feet from where the desk met the floor. The inspector, when he arrived later, would assume Whitmore had been sitting at his desk when he died, had collapsed, and the chair had rolled back with his weight. That was the obvious reading, and it was wrong. I knelt down and examined the carpet beneath the chair. The carpet was thick, good quality, Indian weave, and it retained the impressions of furniture placed upon it for long periods. I could see the permanent indentations where the chair's 4 legs habitually rested. The chair was not in those indentations. It was 3 feet to the left. Now, a chair rolling backward under a man's collapsing weight will roll directly back. It will not move sideways. There is no force in a man's death that would carry a chair laterally across a carpet. Someone had moved the chair after Whitmore died. I stood and looked at the desk. There was a faint smear on the leather desktop surface, barely visible. The kind of mark a sleeve might make if someone had leaned across a body to reach something. The killer had not simply killed Edward Whitmore and left. They had taken something from the desk. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace stood a carriage clock. Brass case, white face, Roman numerals. The kind of clock that sits in 10,000 English studies. It read 9 minutes past 11. The housekeeper had told Lady Whitmore that she heard a crash in the study at approximately 10:30. So the clock was correct, roughly. Whitmore had died around that time. The clock had fallen or been disturbed, and it now read 9 minutes past 11. Except the clock was still running. A stopped clock shows the time it stopped. A running clock shows the current time. This clock was running, keeping perfect time. And when I held my pocket watch beside it, it matched my watch exactly. The clock had not been stopped by any crash or disturbance. I examined the clock more closely. The winding mechanism on the back had been turned recently. The brass was slightly warm from handling, and there was a fresh mark on the key slot where a key had been inserted with some force. Someone had wound this clock forward by approximately 40 minutes. If a witness said the crash happened at 10:30 and the clock read 9 minutes past 11, the natural assumption was that the clock confirmed the time. The police would accept it. They would not question a clock that was still running. But the killer had made an error. They wound the clock forward to create a false timeline, to give themselves more time before suspicion fell upon them. But they could not stop the clock from running. And a clock wound forward is still running, still keeping accurate time. It tells you nothing about when it was wound. They had wasted their effort and handed me a clue. The fireplace held ash. That in itself was unremarkable. It was November. Fires were lit daily in London houses of this class. But I noticed 2 things about this ash that the inspector would never have thought to ask about. First, the ash was fresh. It was light grey, almost white, with no damp in it. A fire that burns overnight and cools by morning produces darker, heavier ash. This ash was from a fire that had burned within the last few hours. Second, the fire had not been lit by the housekeeper that morning. I confirmed this by speaking briefly to the housekeeper before I entered the room. She had lit no fire in the study. She had not been permitted in the study. Her master's instructions. So who had lit a fire in Edward Whitmore's study on the morning of his death? I took a poker and carefully moved the ash aside. At the very base of the grate, where most of it had burned away to nothing, I found the fragment of what had once been a document. A corner, roughly 2 inches wide, with no more than a handful of words still legible. The words were in a formal hand. The paper was heavy stock, the kind used for legal documents or formal correspondence. I could read only 6 words. And the debt shall be settled by... Someone had burned a document in this fireplace on the morning of Whitmore's death. A document that mentioned debt. And they had burned it before the body was discovered. Before anyone came in. If you notice what others walk past, you think the way I do. Subscribe. The button is below. Now, back to Whitmore Manor. We are only halfway through. On the corner of the desk, nearest to the window, sat a teacup. Still half full. The tea was cold. It was placed on the left side of the desk. Now, a small detail. One that means almost nothing in isolation. But I had already spoken briefly with Lady Whitmore before entering the room. And she had mentioned, without being prompted, that her husband had broken his left wrist in a riding accident 15 years ago. The wrist had never fully recovered. He wrote, ate, and reached with his right hand almost exclusively. A right-handed man, sitting at his own desk, does not habitually place his teacup on his left side. He places it where his dominant hand can reach without crossing his body. This cup was on the left. It was possible, of course, that Whitmore had placed it there himself.
Terms are quite favorable.
People do not always act out of habit.
We must ensure the subcommittee agrees on the
But combined with the sleeve smear on the desk and the moved chair, I noted it as a reasonable suggestion. A second person had sat in this room, on the visitor's side of the desk, and had at some point handled this cup. A person who reached instinctively to their left, possibly left-handed. Nothing certain yet, but the detail went into my records. The killer had not broken in and immediately killed Whitmore. They had sat with him first, long enough to drink tea. Had not seen the dog until that moment. He appeared at the doorway. A large, dark Irish setter, perhaps 5 years old. And he stood there watching me with an expression that I can only describe as deeply uncertain. He did not bark. He did not approach me. He stood very still with his ears flat. And he looked not at me, but past me, at the body of his master. I have observed many dogs in the course of my work. A dog's behavior at a crime scene is a vastly underestimated source of information. Dogs do not lie. They cannot. What I noticed was this. The dog was not frightened of the room itself. He was not frightened of the smell of death. Animals grow accustomed to that faster than humans do. He was not barking at a stranger. He was uncertain. He was confused. I have seen dogs react to violent intruders, They bark, they pace, they are agitated in a specific way that speaks to the presence of threat. This dog had not experienced threat. He had experienced betrayal. I stepped toward him slowly, and I held out my hand. He sniffed it. Then he turned and walked away down the hallway. He had come to the door to look at his master. That was all. But in his quiet, uncertain eyes, I read the answer to a question I had not yet formed into words. The dog had known the killer, had greeted them perhaps, had wagged his tail, which meant the killer was a regular visitor to this house, someone the dog considered familiar, safe, not a stranger, not a thief, a friend of the family. I should tell you about the floor. The Persian rug that covered most of the study was a deep red and blue weave, and against those dark colors, mud showed clearly. There were 2 tracks of mud on that carpet. One track came from the main door of the study, the door that opened onto the hallway. This was a light, thin mud. London street mud, the kind you pick up walking across a pavement on a November morning. The other track was different. The second set of marks came from the window side of the room. They were heavier, darker, rich with clay and something organic. Leaf matter, I thought, or wet grass. Not London street mud at all. Garden mud. I looked at the carpet between the window and the desk. The marks followed a line from the window to the fireplace, then to the desk, then back toward the window. The killer had not entered through the front door. They had entered through the garden. I looked at the window again. Same window where I had found the elbow marks in the dust. It opened inward on a simple latch. A person of moderate agility could have lifted the latch from outside with a thin implement and climbed through. But this raised a new question. If the killer entered through the garden window, how did they leave? The mud tracks ended at the desk. They did not return to the window. The carpet near the window showed no outgoing marks, which meant the killer had left through the front door, through the hallway, past the other rooms. They had entered as an intruder and left as a guest. On the chain of Edward Whitmore's waistcoat hung a gold pocket watch. I drew it out carefully, using 2 fingers of the chain, not touching the case itself, and held it to the light. It was a fine instrument. Swiss movement, 18-karat gold case, engraved on the back with a Whitmore family crest. The watch showed the time as 11 minutes past 11, which matched my own watch almost exactly. I wound the crown gently. It stopped after barely a quarter turn. A pocket watch of this quality needs to be wound daily. When fully unwound, it will stop within 12 to 16 hours. When wound that morning, it has a full day's worth of tension in its spring. This watch had been wound very recently, within the last few hours. There was almost no give left in the crown at all. Now here is the detail that matters. Lady Whitmore had told me when I asked about her husband's habits that Edward wound his watch every morning before breakfast. Every morning without fail. He wound it at the breakfast table with his coffee. He had never wound his watch at night. The watch had been wound after Whitmore was dead. Why would anyone wind a dead man's watch? For the same reason they wound the clock on the mantelpiece. To move time. To suggest that Whitmore had been alive later than he actually was. To give the killer more time before the gap between fact and alibi became impossible to hide. But the killer had not thought it through. A fully wound watch in the morning is normal. A fully wound watch at 11 o'clock in the evening would be remarkable. A man winding his watch twice in one day. The watch did not confirm the false timeline. It destroyed it. There was a mirror on the wall behind the desk. Oval, dark wooden frame, positioned at approximately head height for a person seated at the desk. I stood behind the desk in the position Whitmore would have occupied when sitting, and I looked into the mirror. It was angled slightly, not facing straight ahead, not reflecting the face of the person sitting at the desk, but tilted perhaps 15 degrees to the left. From that angle, a seated person could see, reflected in the mirror, the door to the study. They could watch the door without turning around.
Observe the
I
dust line,
examined the
Watson.
mirror's frame.
The mirror was
It
precisely
was mounted
here
on two
until our
small
culprit
brass
moved
hooks
it.
set into the wall. The hooks were positioned to hold the mirror straight, centered, facing forward. But the mirror was not straight. It was tilted. I could see, on the wall beside the right-hand hook, a faint rectangular impression in the plaster. A ghost image of where the mirror had previously sat, flush against the wall, centered perfectly. The mirror had been moved. Not by a huge amount, an inch or two. Just enough to change the angle. I thought about this for a long moment. Who moves a mirror? A housekeeper moves a mirror. A housekeeper moves a mirror when cleaning. But the housekeeper had not been permitted in this room. Whitmore himself might have moved it. But why would a man adjust the angle of a mirror so that he could watch his own study door? Unless he was afraid of someone. Unless he expected a visitor he did not trust. A visitor he could not refuse. And he had adjusted that mirror so he could see when the door opened behind him. He had been frightened. In his own home, at his own desk. He had angled a mirror to watch the door because he wanted to know the moment it happened when someone came in. He knew he was in danger. He watched the door. And still he died. Let me draw it together. Detail 1 told me the crime was premeditated. Someone had observed this house and chosen their point of entry before the morning of the killing. Detail 2 told me something was taken from the desk after Whitmore died. Detail 3 told me the killer adjusted the mantelpiece clock, hastily, judging by the scratch on the key slot, to suggest a later time of death. Detail 4 told me a formal document was burned in the fireplace, a document referencing debt. Detail 5 suggested the killer was left-handed and had sat with Whitmore long enough to drink
The terms
tea.
are quite favorable.
Indeed.
Detail
We
6
must ensure
suggested the killer was familiar to the
And
household,
ensure the drawing room
a
is
regular visitor. Detail 7 told me the killer entered through the garden window and left through the front door. They knew the house. They were comfortable in it. Detail 8, combined with the adjusted clock, told me the killer spent time after Whitmore's death, altering the apparent time of his death. Detail 9 told me Whitmore himself had been afraid of a specific visitor and had prepared himself, however inadequately, for their arrival. I left the study. I closed the door behind me, and I went to find Lady Whitmore. Lady Whitmore was waiting in the morning room at the end of the hallway. She stood when I entered. Her composure had held, but her hands gave her away. She was turning a small ring on her right hand, over and over, without being aware of it. A habit under stress. I asked her 2 questions. The first, did her husband have any outstanding financial disputes? She looked at me for a long moment before answering. Then she said yes. Her brother, Reginald Ashworth, had borrowed a significant sum from Edward 3 years ago. Edward had recently informed her that Reginald had failed to repay it, and that he intended to formalize the debt as a legal matter. She had not known the full amount. She suspected it was large. My second question, was her brother left-handed? She said yes. Reginald had always written with his left hand. He had been left-handed since childhood. I thanked her and asked one final thing. Did her brother know the garden of this house well? She said he had spent a great deal of time here over the years. He knew the garden as well as he knew his own. Reginald Ashworth, Lady Whitmore's brother. Edward Whitmore's former business partner and debtor. A man who visited this house regularly. Known to the dog. Known to the household. Comfortable in the hallway. Familiar with the garden and the window latch. Left-handed. He had come that morning through the garden window. The window he had seen from outside while planning his visit. With the burned document in his coat pocket, ready to destroy the debt agreement the moment Whitmore was dead. He had sat with Whitmore first, perhaps hoping to negotiate. The conversation had failed. Then he had killed him. Then he had burned the document, taken back whatever written evidence of the debt existed on Whitmore's desk, moved the chair, wound the clock, wound the watch, left through the front door. A thorough man, a methodical man, but not thorough enough, because a room remembers. Every clock on a windowsill, every scratch on a key slot, every inch of displaced furniture. The room holds all of it. The room does not forget thoughts to children spent 40 minutes trying to make it forget. When I presented my findings to Inspector Lestrade that afternoon and told him to look at Reginald Ashworth's left wrist, specifically for a concluding's red mark consistent with climbing through a narrow too-young window latch, he found it. Ashworth to arrested the following morning. People ask me sometimes how I see what I see. The answer is the same every time. I look. Not harder than other people, I simply refuse to decide what is important before I have looked at all of it. Most people walk into a room and immediately begin sorting: important, unimportant, relevant, irrelevant. The dust on the windowsill means nothing. The mirror is just a mirror. But nothing is just anything. Every detail in a room is a sentence in a story that the room is trying to tell you. Your only task is to read it without deciding in advance what it says. Edward Whitmore could not speak for himself, but that study spoke for him. It told me everything. The fear he had felt, the visitor he had prepared for, the debt that had killed him, and Reginald Ashworth, who had spent those 40 careful minutes rearranging the room to say nothing at all, had failed entirely. Because the room remembered. Rooms always do. These are my case records. If you have followed me this far, you have the mind for this work. The next entry is already written. Subscribe to this casebook, and I will show you another case, another room, full of details that most people walk straight past.